Hi, everybody. Welcome to Learning and Memory Online. We're going to try to do some short videos for the rest of the semester on important topics, but the full slide sets are always going to be available on Canvas, and you can use the discussion boards to post questions, and so we can use that to focus where we want to spend our time. But for now, I do want to post a little bit about behavioral issues related to operant conditioning so that we can get the conversation started a little bit. I will likely post another video with some neuroanatomy issues later, but we'll focus on behavior for now. I want to keep these videos as short as possible so that our attention spans can remain focused. You'll probably hear my kids in the background. Don't worry, we'll all get used to this new learning environment as much as we can. You know, it'll be a little bumpy, but we'll make it work. So again, this is a shortened version of the behavioral part of the slide set, but I want to talk about something in particular. So you should definitely be familiar with the behavior in general. I'm going to assume that you've read the book and you understand some of the basics, but just to give us some context, right? In Unit 2, like I mentioned right before we left, which is feeling like ages ago now, but Unit 2 is all about building stimulus associations, right? The learning is actually between two different stimuli, like in classical conditioning, learning that a conditioned stimulus is going to predict the presentation of an unconditioned stimulus. In Unit 3, we're now moving to stimulus response learning happening. So the association is between a stimulus and then a response that is going to be made in response to that stimulus. So that's where we're going in Unit 3. So one of the big tricky parts of this is learning the 4 different types of paradigms in operant conditioning. And this is something that even when students feel confident, it remains tricky to identify a given scenario as one of these. I think it's important to remember that reinforcement is always about increasing a behavior. So if the goal is to increase behavior, then that's reinforcement. If the purpose or the outcome is to decrease behavior, then that's punishment. If we're talking about positive and negative, this isn't good and bad. It's about whether you're adding or removing in the outcome. So if you're adding something, it's positive, and if you're removing something, it's negative. And right now on Socrative, if you log in and go to my room, there's a quiz open that goes through a whole bunch of different examples. So you should go and test yourself. And then if you have questions about any of that, you can go to the discussion board and we can talk about it there. There's also a PDF of the quiz if you're not able to log in and do it while it's open. So either way, you can test yourself on Socrative or using the PDF, but try and do it on Socrative so I can get a sense of how everybody's doing. I'll leave that open for a while, so it'll be open at least the rest of today for you to try and go through there. What I want to focus on, again, assuming that you've kind of read and understand the basics, is what helps determine how effective an operant conditioning training paradigm is going to be. And just like we talked about with classical conditioning, timing and schedule is really important for how effective that's going to be, right? So the closer in time the behavior is to the consequence. Ooh, I have to move my face around here. That's annoying. The closer in time a behavior and a consequence, the better the learning is going to be. So if the consequence is always right after the behavior with no delay, right, we're going to see an increase in learning that happens pretty quickly, but at different delays, that learning is going to slow down. And if it gets too far away, then that association is not going to be able to be learned at all, right? So this actually mirrors classical conditioning pretty well. So another big area of confusion here always comes around the schedules of reinforcement, right? So we have the 4 different paradigms. We also have different schedules And here we're just talking about reinforcement. So these don't apply to punishment. I'll make a quick note about punishment at the end here, but these are just the different schedules for how you can reinforce behavior, right? So we have fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Ratio is always about learning that a certain number of responses is going to produce an outcome. And interval training is always about a certain amount of time before a response is going to produce an outcome, right? So let's work through each one of these a little bit. So fixed ratio means every certain number of responses will produce one outcome. So in this little cartoon here, this man pulls a lever, he gets an ice cream cone. Next time, pulls a lever, gets an ice cream cone. Pulls a lever, gets an ice cream cone. That's a fixed ratio of 1. Every single time they pull the lever, they get an ice cream cone, right? In this next scenario, one lever pull, nothing happens. Second lever pull, ice cream cone. Again, 2 times, then an ice cream cone. So that's a fixed ratio of 2, right? And you can see the same thing as we move up to 3, right? So just every certain number of responses, the outcome actually happens. Etc. Can do it for any, right? So this, if we look at it graphically, is represented by the blue line in this graph, right? So we see that the responses over time, cumulative number of responses goes up, right? But it's a little bit of a jagged line there. Basically what that is that every time there's a reinforcement, the animal or person tends to lag a little bit. They've gotten the reward. They know they're not going to get it right away again if we're talking about a fixed ratio of 5. And so there's a little bit of a dip in motivation to try and work for that reward, right? But then they want it again, so then they'll start doing it, and they'll do it enough. They know they have to do it 5 times to get that reward, right? And so the higher that ratio, the longer the pause is after the reward. If it's a fixed ratio of 1, it would look very different, right? But if we do this at a ratio of 5, we see an increase to get the reward, and they stop doing it for a little bit, and increase again when they want it, and so on. So it's still steady, but it's not exactly continuous. Variable ratio is a much more successful schedule of reinforcement, right? So every certain number of responses produces an outcome, but X is variable. It's not the same, right? So let's look at our same situation here, pulling a lever to get an ice cream cone. All right, here on the 3rd time, got an ice cream cone. Oh, now it took 7 times before we get an ice cream cone. Oh, next time ice cream cone. Oh, ice cream cone again. Keep working, keep working. Oh, that took a really long time that time to get an ice cream cone, but man, did we want that, right? So 3, 7, 1, 1, 18. So there were 30 total attempts, 5 rewards. So this would actually, on average, then be every 6 times you get a reward, right? So the variable ratio there is 6. It's the average number of responses that gets that desired outcome. And so this is what we see in this red line here. And you'll notice this is much steeper, right? That learning, that behavior increase is happening a lot faster. This is a very motivating schedule. If the reward is interesting and motivating for the animal or person, then on a variable schedule, they tend to work very hard, right? So this would be an example of the data in a variable ratio of 5 compared to that fixed ratio of 5. Right? We get a constant and high rate of responding with this schedule of reinforcement. And this is actually what we see in gambling, video games, sporting events, where behaviors get rewarded, but it's not consistent. It takes a certain number of behaviors, right? So if you think about a slot machine, right, you can see why people can get addicted to gambling, right? Every certain number of pulls, there's going to be a win, but you don't know how many it is. And so you keep working to try and get that, right? Video games, if you've ever played games where you get items or different types of rewards when you play, right? It's variable, and so it remains very motivating to get there. Variable ratio is the strongest motivating schedule. You will get the fastest and best learning from a variable ratio. Ratio in general is better than interval at the same level, right? So let's talk about interval. Interval is after a certain number of seconds, then a response is going to produce an outcome. And a fixed interval would be a fixed amount of time. So let's say it's 1 minute, and then you get an ice cream cone, another minute, ice cream cone, fixed ratio of 1, right? We can see this at different levels, right? So basically, before that interval of time expires, the behavior has no consequence, right? Once the animal or person learns, they're not really going to do that behavior until you get close to the time that that interval is going to be up, right? There's no effect. They can keep working before that interval comes up, right? Hundreds of times, but it doesn't matter. It's always based on the amount of time, right? So they learn pretty quickly that it's only useful when you're up at that interval, right? And so we see a different kind of pattern here than we did for ratio. Ratio is more stepwise, right, for that fixed interval. But here, there's really not much behavior, and then you get close to the interval, the big ramp up, and then they stop, and then it kind of ramps up again as we get close to the next interval. Here we're looking at a 10-second fixed interval, right? And so we really only see behavior increase right around the time of that interval change. Variable interval, again, same idea as variable ratio, that it's still based on time, but the time now is varied. So it's an average amount of time, right? So 1 minute, get an ice cream cone, 5 minutes, get an ice cream cone, 8 minutes, right? You can get the average of that amount of time, and it's different from a fixed kind of scenario, right? And again, right, there's a little bit more learning in this case because you don't know exactly how long the interval is, so you might periodically go back and check to see if you've reached that interval. And so we do get a little bit better learning, but it's not as good as variable ratio, right? So we do see more cumulative responses and a more steady increase, right? But not as much as variable ratio, which was very, very steep, right? So in general, remember that for ratio and interval, variable is better than fixed, and the best overall, the quickest and steepest learning curve we're going to see is for variable ratio, right? And something to remember in general for this type of relationship, that the stimulus is a discriminating stimulus. It provides context for that learning, right? So an animal, for example, learns that when you turn a light on, if it presses a lever, it's going to get food. But if the light's not on, pressing that lever is not going to get food. So it's still learning that there's a signal that tells us when a certain behavior is going to produce a desirable outcome. And one final note about punishment, because remember that these schedules are for reinforcement in particular. Punishment typically only works if you punish every time the behavior happens. If the punishment has a discriminating stimulus, it typically encourages cheating, right? And so a really great example of this is speeding in your car, right? You know that if you see a police officer and you're speeding, you're probably going to get pulled over, right? But if there's no one around, speeding doesn't have a consequence, right? So in that discriminating stimulus of a police officer being around, right, you may behave properly then, but without that discriminating stimulus, right, you kind of cheat the system a little bit. So punishment works best if the contingency, that discriminating stimulus, is always in place. So punishment's a little bit different than reinforcement. All right, I'm going to stop that video now. This was probably already too long, right? But ask questions about any of this stuff and any of the other behavioral aspects that you read about in the book and are in the longer slide set, right? We need to help each other by asking important questions and seeing what things don't make sense. And please take that Socrative quiz so that we can check and see if those different paradigms are making sense or not. All right. Good luck. We're all going to get through this together. Stay healthy and stay home if you can. Let me know if you have any questions.